You're listening to HOA Karen Gets Denied. A timestamp mismatch cracked it open. Karen leaned over my porch rail yelling that she had a timeline and I was on it again. "You are not allowed to do that without a permit," she said, waving a clipboard in a clear sleeve like it was a weapon. I stood there with my car key fob clenched in my fist, my gray work shirt still damp from the rain, and I knew exactly what she was doing. She was restarting the same playbook she used 2 years ago when my neighbor got hit with fake parking violations and a lien that almost cost him his house. My name is on a vendor invoice that appeared in the budget packet last month with a blank description, and Patricia Morgan refused to explain it when I asked at the quarterly meeting. She is the rules interpretation chair for the Whispering Pines Commons Association here in Bend, Oregon, and she claims she wrote the covenants herself. That is not true, but she says it so often that half the board believes her. I work as an accountant, I keep a clean ledger and receipts, and I knew that invoice was fake the second I saw it. The line matched an HOA vendor payment that was not in the budget packet, and the timestamp on the portal upload did not match the meeting date. I took a screenshot and saved it to a folder I started 2 years ago when the same thing happened to my neighbor. Patricia stepped closer to the rail, and her portable thermal printer was already whirring out a fresh notice. The badge clip with a blank face on her cardigan caught the light. "You do not build to my standard, you pay to my standard," she said, smiling like she had already won. That was her favorite line, and I had heard it a dozen times. She handed me the notice without waiting for a response. I took it without flinching, because I knew what it would trigger. The second I filed a formal complaint about selective enforcement, she would have to produce records, and I would get my chance to compare timestamps and upload logs. That was my plan, but I did not tell her that yet. She turned and walked back toward the street, her blue baseball cap low over her eyes, and I could see her truck idling at the curb. A mail carrier was trying to get around the crowd at the mailbox cluster, but Patricia had parked her truck right in the way. The carrier waved once and then gave up, turning around to deliver the next street first. I watched Patricia climb into her truck and drive off, and I looked down at the notice in my hand. It said I had violated parking rules by allowing a contractor to park in a guest spot for more than 2 hours. The contractor had been there for 90 minutes, and I had the invoice to prove it. But that did not matter to Patricia. She was targeting my guests and contractors with parking warnings and intimidation, and this was the third notice in 2 weeks. I could not afford to take time off for surprise hearings and forced meetings. My schedule was packed, and every time Patricia called an emergency enforcement session, I had to scramble to rearrange client calls and deadline work. The stakes were real. If I missed a hearing, the fine would double automatically, and the HOA could file a lien without another vote. That was how they got my neighbor 2 years ago. He missed one hearing because he was out of town for work, and Patricia filed the lien the next day. By the time he got back, the attorney fees were more than the fine, and he had to sell his truck to pay it off. I walked back inside and pulled out my binder. It was a 3-ring binder with a clear cover, stuffed with printed emails, budget packets, portal screenshots, and handwritten notes. I had been collecting evidence for 2 years, and every time Patricia targeted someone, I added another page. The first page was a copy of the original complaint my neighbor filed before he gave up. It listed the same fake parking violations, the same backdated notices, and the same vendor invoice with a blank description. I flipped through the pages and found the bank statement line I had printed last month. It matched the HOA vendor payment exactly, but the vendor was not listed in the approved budget, and Patricia had never explained who they were or what the payment was for. Thunder rumbled in the distance, low and heavy, and I knew I had to move fast. The mail carrier had just confirmed a delivery window for a certified envelope I was expecting, and I had to photograph the envelope before it was lost. Patricia had a habit of intercepting mail that looked official, and I had seen her do it twice. The first time, a neighbor never received a hearing notice and got fined for not showing up. The second time, a records request response disappeared from the mailbox cluster, and the HOA claimed it was never sent. I was not going to let that happen again. I grabbed my phone and headed back outside. The mail carrier was at the next cluster down the street, and I jogged over before Patricia could circle back. The carrier looked up and nodded. "You, the guy waiting on the certified envelope?" he asked. I said yes, and he pulled it out of his bag. I took a photo of the envelope with my phone before I even signed for it. The return address was from the HOA management company, and the tracking number was printed on the side. I signed the slip and thanked him, and he shook his head. "That lady tried to tell me she could sign for your mail last week," he said. I told her that is not how it works. He walked off, and I stood there holding the envelope, already knowing what was inside. I opened it carefully and pulled out the response to my records request. It was a single page with a paragraph that said the HOA did not have any records matching my description, and the vendor invoice I asked about was part of a confidential contract. That was a lie. The vendor was listed in the budget packet summary, and the payment had cleared the HOA account. I took a photo of the response and added it to my phone folder. Then I walked back to my porch and sat down to plan my next move. Patricia showed up again the next morning with an inspection crew. They were wearing reflective vests and carrying clipboards, and Patricia was leading them like she was running a crime scene. She pointed at my driveway, my porch rail, my mailbox, and my garbage cans. One of the crew members took photos, and another one wrote notes on a clipboard. I stood in my doorway with my arms crossed, watching the whole thing. Patricia walked up to the porch and smiled. "We are conducting a compliance audit," she said. "You will receive a full report within 5 business days." I asked her who authorized the audit, and she said the board voted on it last month. I knew that was a lie because I had watched the meeting video, and there was no vote on audits. But I did not argue. I just nodded and went back inside. 5 days later, I got the report. It was 12 pages long, printed on HOA letterhead, and it listed 17 violations. Most of them were minor cosmetic issues like a crack in my driveway or a mailbox post that was 2 inches out of alignment. But 3 of them were serious: unauthorized parking, improper guest registration, and failure to maintain exterior paint standards. Each violation had a fine attached, and the total was over $2,000. I had 30 days to pay or request a hearing. I requested the hearing immediately, and I attached a copy of my records request response and a list of questions I wanted answered under oath. Patricia called me 2 days later. She said the hearing was scheduled for the following week, and I had to submit my evidence 48 hours in advance. I asked her why the deadline was so short, and she said that was the policy. I checked the bylaws, and the policy said evidence could be submitted up to 24 hours before the hearing. She had just moved the goalpost. I pointed that out, and she said the board had updated the policy at the last meeting. I asked for a copy of the updated policy, and she said it would be posted on the portal within a week. I hung up and added another note to my binder. The hearing was held in the community center, and I showed up with my binder and a printed copy of every document I had collected. Patricia was already there, sitting at the head table with 2 other board members. She had her clipboard in front of her and her portable thermal printer on the side table. The cheap plastic badge she wore said Rules Chair, and she tapped it twice when I walked in. I sat down in the front row, and Patricia called the hearing to order. She read the list of violations out loud, and then she asked me if I had anything to say. I stood up and opened my binder. I started with the parking violation and pulled out the contractor invoice. It showed the arrival time and the departure time, and it proved the contractor was there for 90 minutes, not more than 2 hours. Patricia looked at it and shook her head. "That does not prove anything," she said. "The rule says no contractor parking in guest spots. Period." I asked her to show me that rule in the bylaws, and she flipped through a laminated policy sheet. She pointed at a line that said guest parking is for residents only. I pointed out that the contractor was my guest, and she said contractors do not count as guests. That was the second time she moved the goalpost. I moved on to the next violation, and I pulled out a photo of my neighbor's driveway. It had the same crack mine did, and it was twice as wide. I asked Patricia why my neighbor was not cited for the same violation, and she said that was a different situation. I asked her to explain the difference, and she said my neighbor had filed for an exception. I asked to see the exception paperwork, and she said it was confidential. I asked if I could file for the same exception, and she said the exception period had closed. That was the third goalpost move, and I could see the other board members starting to shift in their seats. Then I pulled out the bank statement line. I held it up and asked Patricia to explain the vendor payment. She looked at it and said it was a standard maintenance contract. I asked her to name the vendor, and she said that was confidential. I asked her why the payment was not in the approved budget, and she said it was covered under discretionary spending. I asked to see the discretionary spending policy, and she said it was in the bylaws. I flipped to the bylaws section in my binder and showed her the page. The discretionary spending limit was $500 per month, and the vendor payment was $3,000. Patricia stared at the page for a long moment, and then she said the payment was spread over multiple months. I asked her to show me the breakdown, and she said she would provide it after the hearing. One of the other board members, a man named Greg, raised his hand. He said he did not remember approving a $3,000 contract, and he wanted to see the paperwork. Patricia said the paperwork was in the office, and she would bring it to the next meeting. Greg said he wanted to see it now, and Patricia said that was not how it worked. Greg stood up and said he was going to the office to look for it himself, and Patricia told him to sit down. He did not sit down. He walked out of the room, and I could hear his footsteps echoing down the hall. The hearing went on for another 30 minutes, and Patricia kept dodging my questions. Every time I asked for proof, she said it was confidential or in the office or being reviewed by the attorney. By the end, I had 16 unanswered questions on my list, and the other board member, a woman named Linda, looked exhausted. Patricia said the board would review my evidence and issue a decision within 10 business days. I said I wanted a written response to every question, and she said that was not required. I asked Linda if that was true, and Linda said she did not know. Patricia adjourned the hearing, and I walked out. Greg caught up with me in the parking lot. He was holding a file folder, and his face was red. "I found something," he said. He opened the folder and showed me a stack of complaints. They were all printed on the same template, and they all had the same formatting errors. The dates were backdated, and the signatures were identical. Greg said he found them in a locked drawer in Patricia's desk, and he made copies before she could catch him. I took the copies and added them to my binder. Greg said he was going to bring it up at the next board meeting, and I told him to be careful. "Patricia has a way of making people disappear from the board," I said. He nodded and said he knew, but he was tired of it. I went home and spent the next 2 days organizing my evidence. I created a timeline with every violation, every payment, every complaint, and every goalpost move. I printed out the portal screenshots and highlighted the timestamp mismatches. I wrote a demand letter that listed every unanswered question and every piece of missing documentation. Then I attached the bank statement line, the template complaints, and the records request denial. I made 3 copies, one for the board, one for the HOA attorney, and one for myself. I mailed the first 2 with tracking, and I kept the third in my binder. The next day, I got a call from the HOA management company. A woman named Rachel said she was the compliance coordinator, and she wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss my complaint. I asked her if she had read my demand letter, and she said she had. I asked her if she had reviewed the attached evidence, and she said she had forwarded it to the attorney. I asked her if the attorney had responded, and she said not yet. I told her I would meet with her, but I wanted Greg and Linda there too. She said that was fine, and we scheduled the meeting for the following week. The meeting was held in the management company office, and Rachel was sitting behind a desk with a laptop and a notepad. Greg and Linda were already there, and Patricia walked in 5 minutes late. She sat down without saying anything, and Rachel started the meeting. She said the attorney had reviewed my complaint and found several procedural issues with the hearing. Patricia interrupted and said the hearing was conducted properly, and I was just trying to waste everyone's time. Rachel held up her hand and said the attorney wanted to review the vendor contract before making a final determination. Patricia said the contract was confidential, and Rachel said the attorney could review it under privilege. Patricia said she did not have the contract with her, and Rachel asked when she could provide it. Patricia said she would check with the vendor, and Rachel said she needed it by the end of the week. If you are enjoying this wild HOA investigation story, hit that like button and subscribe for more real revenge moments and HOA chaos. Linda asked Patricia about the template complaints Greg had found. Patricia Patricia said she did not know what Linda was talking about, and Greg pulled out the folder. He handed it to Rachel, and Rachel flipped through the pages. She looked up at Patricia and asked if these were official HOA complaints. Patricia said they were resident complaints, and Rachel asked why they were all formatted the same way. Patricia said residents used a template she provided to make it easier. Rachel asked if Patricia had signed them on behalf of the residents, and Patricia said she was authorized to do that as rules chair. Rachel said that was not how the bylaws worked, and Patricia said the board had given her that authority. Linda said she did not remember voting on that, and Greg said he did not either. Rachel closed the folder and said she was going to recommend a full audit of the HOA records. Patricia stood up and said that was unnecessary, and Rachel said the attorney would make the final decision. Patricia walked out, and I could hear her truck starting in the parking lot. Rachel looked at me and said she would be in touch. I thanked her and left, and Greg walked out with me. He said he was going to resign from the board if Patricia did not step down, and I told him to wait until after the audit. He said he would think about it. 2 weeks later, Rachel called me again. She said the attorney had reviewed the vendor contract and found that it was never approved by the board. The payment was made from the HOA account without authorization, and the vendor was a shell company with no business license. Rachel said the attorney was recommending that the board file a police report and remove Patricia from her position. I asked her what happened to my violations, and she said they were dismissed. I asked if I would get a refund for the hearing fee, and she said yes. I thanked her and hung up. The next board meeting was packed. Every seat was filled, and people were standing in the back. Patricia was sitting at the head table, and she looked smaller than usual. Greg stood up and made a motion to remove Patricia from the rules chair position and to refer the vendor payment to law enforcement. Linda seconded the motion, and the board voted 5-1 in favor. Patricia was the only no vote. She stood up and said she was going to sue the board for defamation, and Greg said she was welcome to try. She walked out, and the room erupted in applause. But the story did not end there. I spent the next month working with Rachel and the attorney to piece together the full scope of Patricia's scheme. We found that she had been staging fake violations for 2 years, targeting homeowners who questioned her authority or who looked like they might run for the board. She used the violations to justify fines, and she used the fines to cover up missing money from the HOA account. The vendor payment was just one piece of it. There were at least 6 other payments to fake vendors, and the total was over $20,000. The bank records showed that Patricia had set up the shell company herself, using her husband's name as the registered agent. She had been submitting fake invoices and approving the payments without board oversight. The attorney said it was one of the most brazen HOA fraud cases he had ever seen, and he recommended that the board file a civil lawsuit in addition to the police report. The police took the case seriously. A detective came to my house and asked me to walk him through my evidence. I showed him the binder, the timeline, the template complaints, and the portal screenshots. He took notes and asked me if I had any other witnesses. I gave him Greg's contact information and the name of the mail carrier who had tried to deliver my certified envelope. The detective said it would take a few months to build the case, but he was confident they could charge Patricia with fraud and embezzlement. During that time, I kept gathering evidence. I filed a second records request, and this time Rachel provided everything I asked for. I got copies of all the board meeting minutes for the past 3 years, all the budget packets, and all the vendor contracts. I found at least a dozen more inconsistencies, including payments to vendors that did not exist and meeting votes that never happened. I documented everything and sent it to the detective. One afternoon, I was standing on my porch when I saw Patricia's truck pull up to the curb. She got out and walked toward me, and I could see she was carrying her clipboard and her thermal printer. I stayed where I was, my car key fob in my hand, and I waited. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at me. "We can tow first and explain later. That is how enforcement works," she said. That was the line she had used on my neighbor 2 years ago, the line that started the whole mess. I smiled and pulled out my phone. I played a recording of the board meeting where Greg made the motion to remove her, and I turned the volume up so she could hear the applause. She stared at me for a long moment, and then she turned and walked back to her truck. The detective called me a few weeks later and said he had enough evidence to make an arrest. Patricia was charged with fraud, embezzlement, and falsifying documents. The case was all over the local news, and the HOA received dozens of complaints from other homeowners who had been targeted by Patricia over the years. The board hired a forensic accountant to review the HOA finances, and the accountant found that Patricia had stolen over $30,000 in total. The criminal case moved slowly, but the civil case moved faster. The HOA board filed a lawsuit against Patricia and her husband, demanding restitution for the stolen money and legal fees. Patricia tried to fight it, but the evidence was overwhelming. Her attorney advised her to settle, and she agreed to pay back the full amount plus interest. The settlement also included a permanent ban from serving on any HOA board in the state, and a written apology to every homeowner she had targeted. I was at the final board meeting when Rachel read the settlement terms out loud. The room was packed again, and people cheered when she got to the part about the permanent ban. Greg stood up and thanked everyone who had helped with the investigation, and he specifically mentioned my binder. He said I had done more to protect the community than anyone else, and he asked the board to pass a resolution commending my work. The board voted unanimously in favor, and I got a plaque with my name on it. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. The best part came a few weeks later. I was checking the mail when the mail carrier stopped and waved. He walked over and said he heard about what happened with Patricia. He said he was glad she was gone because she had been harassing him and other delivery drivers for years. He told me that Patricia used to call the post office and file complaints whenever a driver did not follow her instructions, and she had tried to get him fired twice. He said he was happy I stood up to her, and he shook my hand before he walked off. That same week, the tow truck driver who had been working with Patricia called me. His name was Dave, and he said he wanted to apologize. He said Patricia had been paying him under the table to tow cars without proper authorization, and he did not realize it was illegal until the police contacted him. He said he cooperated with the investigation and provided records of every tow Patricia had requested. He said he felt terrible about what happened to my neighbor 2 years ago, and he offered to refund the tow fee. I told him I appreciated it, but I wanted him to refund my neighbor instead. He said he would, and he kept his word. The fallout kept coming. A few neighbors who had been silent during the investigation started coming forward with their own stories. One woman said Patricia had fined her 3 times for the same violation, and another man said Patricia had tried to force him to pay for repairs that were the HOA's responsibility. They all asked how they could get their money back, and I told them to file complaints with the board and attach copies of their paperwork. Within a month, the board had received over 20 complaints, and Rachel was working full-time to process them all. The board passed a new policy requiring all fines and violations to be reviewed by a neutral hearing officer before they could be enforced. The policy also required the board to post all vendor contracts and payments on the portal within 30 days, and it gave homeowners the right to request an independent audit at any time. Greg said it was the biggest reform in the HOA's history, and he credited my investigation for making it happen. Patricia tried to make a comeback a few months later. She showed up at a board meeting and demanded to speak during the public comment period. The board allowed it, and she stood up and said the investigation was a witch hunt and that she had been unfairly targeted. She said the charges against her were based on lies and that she was going to clear her name. Greg interrupted and said she had already admitted to the fraud as part of her settlement agreement, and she had signed a document agreeing not to contest the findings. Patricia said the settlement was coerced, and Greg said she was free to take it up with her attorney. She sat down, and the board moved on to the next item. It was the last time anyone saw her at a meeting. The cold case I had reopened turned out to be bigger than I thought. The forensic accountant found that Patricia had been running the same scheme for at least 5 years, and she had targeted more than 30 homeowners during that time. The total amount stolen was closer to $50,000, and the accountant said it was one of the largest HOA fraud cases he had seen in Oregon. The police expanded their investigation, and they found evidence that Patricia had been working with a property management employee who had access to the HOA bank accounts. The employee was arrested and charged as an accomplice, and the management company fired him immediately. The property management company also faced consequences. The board filed a complaint with the state regulatory agency, and the agency launched an investigation into the company's oversight practices. The investigation found that the company had failed to conduct regular audits and had ignored multiple red flags about Patricia's behavior. The agency issued a formal reprimand and required the company to implement new internal controls. Rachel kept her job, but the company hired a new director of compliance to oversee all HOA accounts. The final showdown happened on my front porch a few months after the settlement was finalized. Patricia showed up with an inspection crew wearing reflective vests, just like she had done before. But this time, I was ready. I had a copy of the restraining order the board had filed against her, and I had already called the police. Patricia walked up to the porch and tried to hand me another violation notice, but I held up the restraining order and told her she was not allowed to be on HOA property. She said the porch was public property, and I said it was not. The police arrived before she could argue further, and they escorted her off the property. One of the officers told her that if she came back, she would be arrested for trespassing. She left, and I never saw her again. The HOA elected a new board a few months later, and the new president was a retired teacher named Susan who had been fighting Patricia for years. Susan said her first priority was to rebuild trust with the homeowners, and she started by hosting monthly town halls where anyone could ask questions or raise concerns. She also hired a new property management company that specialized in transparency and accountability. The new company posted all financial records on the portal, and they sent out quarterly newsletters explaining how the HOA money was being spent. Susan also pushed through a new bylaw that required all board members to complete training on fiduciary responsibility and conflict of interest. The bylaw included a provision that any board member who violated the rules would be automatically removed and banned from serving again. Greg said it was the kind of reform the HOA should have had years ago, and he thanked me again for making it happen. The entire experience taught me that HOAs can be fixed, but it takes work. It takes someone willing to dig through the records, ask the hard questions, and hold people accountable. It takes neighbors who are willing to speak up and support each other. And it takes a board that is willing to listen and make changes. I was lucky to have all of those things, and I know a lot of people are not. Looking back, I am glad I reopened the cold case. My neighbor got his money back, and so did a lot of other people. Patricia was held accountable, and the HOA implemented real reforms. The community is stronger now, and people are not afraid to question the board or push back against bad policies. That is how it should be, and I am proud to have been part of it. The story did not end perfectly. Patricia never apologized to anyone except in the settlement document, and I know she still believes she did nothing wrong. But she lost her position, her reputation, and a lot of money. She can never serve on an HOA board again, and she will have a criminal record for the rest of her life. That is enough for me. The HOA stopped selective enforcement after complaints piled up, and the new board made sure everyone was treated fairly. Karen got a written warning for harassment behavior before the restraining order was filed, and it became part of the official record. The payback came in the form of a written records production schedule that Karen could not interfere with, and it forced the board to be transparent about everything. The funny karma moment happened at the meeting when Patricia tried to interrupt the vote to remove her, and the board voted anyway. She stood there with her mouth open, and Greg smiled and said, "We can explain later. That is how enforcement works." The room erupted in laughter, and Patricia walked out. I still live in the same house, and I still serve on the HOA board as the treasurer. I keep the books clean, and I make sure every payment is documented and approved. I also keep my binder up to date, just in case. Because you never know when someone else might try to pull the same scheme, and you never know when you will need to reopen another cold case. Thanks for watching, and I appreciate your time.